Welcome, friends, to the Earth Keepers podcast. This podcast is for people who seek new and better ways to love and care for the earth. It's a podcast for anyone who is deeply concerned about the harm being done to the environment on a local and global level. It's a podcast that builds community and connection between people of like heart and mind, people who believe that earth care should be integrated into every aspect of life, and for many in the Earth Keepers community, that includes our spiritual practices. My name is Forrest Inslee, and in this episode we'll be talking to author Hannah Anderson and her husband and illustrator Nathan Anderson. Together they have collaborated on a book that will be released this week called Turning of Days, Lessons from Nature, Season, and Spirit. This powerful work helps readers to perceive the lessons that are present in every aspect of creation, if only we have eyes to see and ears to hear.
My mind whirls with all it knows and all it doesn't. There are mysteries in this world, not just of science, but of conscience. Mysteries of unity and continuity, of both wonder and groaning, of creation awaiting redemption. What might I learn were I to crouch down and turn my eyes and tune my ears? What might I discover of pain and loss, of beauty and truth? What might I find were I to drop my shoulders, lift my head, and keep watch in this world? What might I learn if I asked the earth to teach me?
Welcome, friends, to Earth Keepers podcast. Today we have two special guests, Hannah and Nathan Anderson, and they have collaborated on a book called Turning of Days. And I'm wondering, Hannah, if you could introduce yourself, and Nathan also introduce yourself and tell us about your respective roles in the book.
Well, I'm Hannah, and I am a writer who lives in Roanoke, Virginia, in the southwest area of the state. We moved back here, my husband Nathan and our three kids, we moved back here about 8 years ago. And I say back because this is Nathan's home area. And I remember at one point, his grandma told me soon after we were married that Virginia boys always come home. And that was definitely true in our process as a family and a couple. And we've moved back to this area, brought back by initially church ministry, but we are putting roots down here, and this is very much home for us.
Yeah, like Hannah mentioned, my name is Nathan, and I grew up in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. And I think as Hannah was able to write Turning of Days, we began to collaborate about illustrating, and I've always enjoyed art and have had amateur training in it and have enjoyed just being in nature and growing up in a very rural setting. And so I always enjoyed representing nature through art, whether that was drawing or photography. And so we were able to collaborate on this book together, which was a great experience.
Hannah, maybe you could tell us about the vision for this book and how it emerged.
The book, Turning of Days, is a collection of 28 brief essays about the natural world, observations that I make with an eye toward what the natural world might teach us spiritually or metaphysically. My hope was to help readers learn a way of looking at the natural world that goes beyond maybe just being inspired by it to understanding that there are deep truths woven into the very fabric of creation. And this really came to me over the course of a couple of years. As Nathan mentioned, he grew up here close to the earth in the Blue Ridge Parkway. I grew up about 5 hours north in southwestern Pennsylvania. But one of the things that we shared is my parents also had small homestead, raised us in very close to the earth and value that kind of engagement. And when we met, that was something that we recognized in each other very quickly. And so our life has always been shaped that way. What I don't think we understood is how unusual that was. And I first began to get a glimpse of that. A few years ago, I wrote a book called Humble Roots. It was about the virtue of humility, but I used a lot of botanical imagery to explain the concept. And a fascinating thing happened. As excited as readers were about the topic, they were equally excited by the botanical imagery. And I had readers writing to me saying, I planted tomatoes for the first time in my life, Or I went out and I bought a fruit tree and we put it in our backyard. And I realized that the experience that I had had of the world and that I shared with Nathan was not necessarily one that was shared more broadly. And so as I pressed into that, I really wanted to write something that would invite people who maybe didn't have that experience into it and show them a way to inhabit, to live within, to engage with the creation around them, that they too could access these truths and experiences that came so organically to us. What I hope readers will feel the call toward is more a way of opening themselves up to observation and awareness. I don't know that this book will teach you a whole lot of specifics, but I do hope that it cracks open the door to a certain way of looking or seeing or perceiving the world around us.
After reading your book, it's been making me think about my relationship to nature. And just to give you an illustration of my experimentation with those changes, this morning I walked out into my backyard to walk with the dogs a bit and just opened myself to receiving, and noticed that while most things were bare and brown, including my climbing roses, there was one brilliantly red rose blooming in the midst of this cold and dreary morning. And I just sort of watched that rose for a few minutes, and seeing that rose, I felt hope welling up in me. And the challenge I took from your book is, I wonder if I can actually ground this in scriptural understanding. And as I thought about it, the words to a hymn that I learned in college choir, "Lo, how a rose e'er blooming." I mean, it seems pretty obvious, right? But it's a nice song. It's a Christmas song. It speaks of the coming of Christ in a time of darkness. It speaks of hope. But I wanted to take it even further, as you do in your book. And I thought, well, where does that image come from? The rose as a symbol for Jesus. And apparently it comes from Isaiah 11. And I'll just read that really quickly. A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his root, a branch will bear fruit. And as I was reading that in Isaiah, again, I could see that this is a message of hope in the midst of a lot of bleakness and despair that Isaiah was speaking about. And for me, it really deepened the message. And it made me realize that, yes, not only is that rose saying have hope, but it's a very specific hope, that I need to remember that in God is hope. Even when things seem dark on a broader level, I can find hope in God and the hope that he brings. So I'll just have to say thank you for one thing. I believe that you're modeling a practice that is pretty important. And I wonder if that was your intention. I mean, it seems like that's the theme throughout the book. You sort of tack back and forth between what nature tells you, but also what Christian scripture tells you.
It was intentional in that I feel like there is this tragic divide, especially within the modern church, within modern Christianity in the West, that tends to prioritize different types of knowledge and separates them. And so there is perhaps a tendency among the modern Western church to approach the scripture primarily as this set of facts or truth factoids, and it's completely divorced from other forms of revelation. And so I did intentionally see this divide and want to perhaps bridge it, perhaps say to readers, actually, we're looking at the same thing. And I do think these are challenges that come to us through modernity, that even our ability to understand specific revelation, perhaps in the scripture, is limited because we're not understanding the underlying categories. Like, we're just getting this kind of surface engagement with reading that comes across much more cerebral and things to be believed and things to be understood, rather than categories to be inhabited, to be embodied and lived out. And so it was intentional. My hope is that it will draw in both directions, that those who perhaps are accustomed to a deep familiarity with scripture will understand that maybe they don't understand it as well as they thought they did because they're detached from natural revelation. And perhaps for those who are strongly rooted in natural revelation, and that's a source of a great deal of wisdom and inspiration, they too can find that this same thing, this same category is also present in a more specific way within special revelation or the scripture.
Nathan, I'm wondering if you can connect to that with your role in the book, and first of all, how the collaboration came about, but maybe more importantly, how you understand the connection between art and revelation through creation. I mean, what was that relationship as you illustrated for Hannah's book?
I think for me, if you step back and look at all the different ways to represent something in art, if you mentioned a rose a moment ago, there's so many ways that an artist can render that. You can do an impression, you can do like an abstract, you can do a photo. There's so many different ways that you can communicate through art a rose. For me specifically, and I think both how I interact with nature and it dovetailed well with the book, the pencil drawings and a little bit more detailed rendering of something was the direction not only I'm more comfortable with in how I communicate through art, but also in communicating natural revelation of an object. So some of the things that I drew, like a morel mushroom, like if you took that mushroom and just looked at it and observed, Hannah's calling her readers to kind of like stop and see and pay attention and listen to what nature teaches you. I think the details of a drawing, a more realistic rendering or a more realistic drawing will help the reader say, okay, I can go look at a mushroom. If you were to see a mushroom in an impression in a museum, you might not have the same connection. So for me, I really enjoy the details, the fine little minutia. Another illustrations that I did, one of them made it in the book, one of them didn't. But I had found a bird skeleton. And so I was drawing the skull from very different angles. And then the feet, I found a couple of the feet there with it. And just the tiny, tiny little talons of this little tiny bird. It might have been a wren. But just if you stop and pay attention and look at the details, and just like your experience in the backyard where you have this very busy world around you and you just want to stop in and focus on one specific thing and let that speak to you. So for me, more realistic drawings are both my preference in my art, but also I think it rendered it well with the book. You also asked about how we collaborated. This is a fun experience for us to work together on this project. It was a lot of back and forth, a lot of, what do you think about this? I think I like this. What do you think? A lot of scrap paper, a lot of sticky notes that we had. But Hannah kind of basically had an outline and said, hey, what can you draw? So she had some essays in mind, says, hey, I would like to do an essay on something. Can you draw this? Mm-hmm. And I would say, well, yeah, I'll give you some renderings and you tell me what you think. There were others where she said, you draw something that you like, and I'll see if I can work that into the book somewhere. So it was a good process, and we enjoyed working together quite a bit.
And I'll just add, we did discuss the way sketches would embody what I was trying to do in the essays. We talked about different approaches, maybe more color or more extensive landscapes, illustrations. And when it came back to it, what Nathan is describing is we really wanted readers to be able to take what we were modeling and work it into their own experience of the world. And so we wanted it to be within their own sense of, well, I can go sit in the backyard and try to draw something.
And I have a pencil and some paper too.
Yeah, and I have pencil and paper. And the same with having short essays. It was more an intentional modeling of this is accessible, this is possible. And so we didn't want it to be too dramatic or anything. We wanted it to really
be accessible and for everybody who reads it, even the way they laid it out with there's wider margins where some of the illustrations are in a margin, like you would just have a pencil and you would be sitting out with a sketch pad or a notebook and journaling and putting a verse down or a hymn down and drawing a rose and just, as you're experiencing nature and letting it communicate to you what it has to say.
Your approach is actually very democratic, and it sounds as if you are saying to people that whether you're an artist or not, you could do this. You could let the act of rendering something on a piece of paper help you to focus in on potentially revelatory details.
And not only can you do it, but you can do it wherever you are. We did a brief little video clip for Moody, I think at the beginning of the shutdowns, at the beginning of the pandemic. And we encourage people wherever you are, even if you're in the city and you don't think you have a lot of nature around you, you do. And, we only have a half an acre and, it's not a huge, we don't have hundreds of acres, which we would love to have it one day, but we don't. But you can see so much just in the grass underneath your feet, the birds in the sky, you step out on your balcony if you're in a city or wherever you are, you can see the natural world around you.
Yes, I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions about being able to engage with creation is that it's a lifestyle. And by that, I mean, you're living out on a homestead or you have a lot of land or you're making all your own food or whatever. And so there's this misconception, I think, particularly for the large populace, that if you have this attention, if you have this kind of awareness, then you also have to have land or you also have to live in rural spaces. And the reality is that we exist within creation everywhere. And you could live in Manhattan and you would still have things that you could observe and note about the natural world around you.
So speaking of the natural world, most of our listeners put a high priority on matters of earth care, environmental advocacy. And I'm wondering, in terms of your lives, how do issues of earth keeping figure into them?
Well, I think two things come to my mind right away. Number one, like I mentioned a moment ago, we just have a little half acre that our house is on, a little ranch house. And we take great joy and I would say pride in stewarding the land that we have, that we care for. We joke that when we moved to our house, there was nothing. Like it was just a yard. There was like no gardens, no trees, nothing. And I've been able to landscape and we do a lot of gardening, both flower gardening and we do a lot of vegetable gardening as well. And so I think stewarding and caring for the land that we have been entrusted with is a huge driving motivation and keeps us focused. I'm also, I know Hannah kind of teases me a little bit about.
This is the official statement. I do not tease him.
She does in a loving way. I'm a member of the Roanoke Valley Bird Club, and we do a lot of advocacy and we do a lot of scholarships for students to go to nature camps. And we sponsor a couple bluebird trails where they keep track of numbering and caring for bluebirds and babies. And part of the bird counts that they do, that the ornithology departments do at like Cornell and the Audubon Society. So that's two things that come to my mind right off the bat, other than the normal things that, recycling, reduce, reuse, recycle, those kind of things that we all do.
And I think what I love that you've done with our land, and, I'll give you full credit for being the mind behind this. You haven't just put in like a yearly garden. You've put in plants and trees and things that will
long outlive us.
It will long outlive us. And I think you're thinking long term about our engagement with the earth. It's not just how can I engage with the earth that will then return for me? It's how can I steward this piece of land? How can I think generationally? How can I think what I've received and what I'm passing on? And so I love that you've had a very clear vision for that. And I think in my work, I do feel like we inhabit this kind of bridge space between maybe the larger public that isn't quite as aware or in tune to these questions, and maybe those who very much their lives and their choices are driven by earthkeeping. And so what I kind of see myself as able to translate maybe between the two communities to say, come this way. This is something worth considering. And then I use a lot of my writing to focus on questions of place and generational engagement with land, and even something as simple as the rhythms of cultivation. And beyond that, obviously, I think we're trying to think holistically within our communities about public policy or those kinds of questions. But I think within our own specific vocations, I do feel a sense of maybe opening the door a little more for, especially those within religious communities, to think about these questions in a way that's not overwhelming for them, but invites them into them.
Earthkeepers podcast seeks to highlight diverse experiences from all walks of life and from different cultures, and to highlight stories of people living all over the world. We invite you to share something that you have learned with the rest of the Earthkeepers community by leaving a short voice message on our website. For example, have you been taking any new steps toward living in a better relationship with creation? If you have children in your life, have you discovered any tips for helping them to learn about recycling or using less energy? Maybe you could share about something that you do that helps you to connect to nature on a deeper level. Please do leave us a quick voice message at circlewood.online/podcast. We might just share it here on the air so that the broader community can learn along with you. Remember, friends, we're all in this together. If you're one of the first 3 people to leave us a message this week, we'll send you a free copy of Hannah Anderson's awesome new book, Turning of Days, Lessons from Nature, Season, and Spirit. On that note, let's get back to our conversation with Hannah and Nathan. In the book, we get a sense that both of you grew up with a deep familiarity with nature, as you've alluded to. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit more about that in order so that we might get to know you a bit better. Talk about how your relationship to creation was actually formed, and maybe tell us about an experience or some influence that began that process in you.
To just pick up on what you said previously about a way of being in the world, I do think there is a question of re-enchanting people to cultivate their imagination for what a certain engagement or relationship with creation would look like. And again, I didn't realize that my imagination had been so shaped and formed by my childhood. So I grew up in southwestern Pennsylvania on land that had been family land, family farm that had, over the generation slowly been parceled out. So by the time I came along, we were living on 10 acres of land that had woods and fields. And it was connected to the land that my aunts and uncles owned as well. And so even though our family had 10 acres, I pretty much had the run of probably 50 or 60 acres. And as a child, that freedom to move across the earth, I could say to my mom, I'm going outside, and outside meant 50 acres. It meant being able just to find my way through the woods, to explore and to just investigate and to find this really a level of independence and freedom and confidence within the broader world on my own. I had to learn other things about how cities work as I grew older, but in terms of the sense of developing my sense of self, it was very much developed within the context of the natural world. And I grew to understand myself in light of these realities. My parents also did a lot of gardening, a lot of canning and preservation. And so it wasn't simply traipsing through the woods or the fields. It was also this very hard one struggle for cultivation and food. And I remember growing up having to pray for rain because what we had put in was not doing well, and we needed shifts in the weather patterns for our work to be productive. And so that also taught you a huge level of dependency and the limitations on your work. And so those kinds of things shaped me in ways that I did not understand until I was older.
And I think similar to Hannah, and probably what brought us together eventually, I grew up very similarly. Just to give you a quick demographic number, the county that I grew up in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, has about 12,000 people, and one high school and graduating class that I had was 124. So it's a very, very small amount of people with a lot of land in the county that I grew up in. So I grew up on a dirt road. You couldn't see our neighbors. We weren't too far from the Blue Ridge Parkway. And my dad was a forester for the state of Virginia. And so my sister and I, we also grew up without a television. So we had the woods to play in. I mean, that was our playground. That was our imagination. I remember she and I, there was a creek that ran through our land, and we would build dams, and we would tell all kinds of stories, and with all kinds of little creatures of the woods, we would make stories up. And so we just lived immersed in nature. And like Hannah said, I knew nothing else. There were points that I just was bored and wanted to go experience other parts of the world, but I didn't realize how lucky I was. And I didn't realize that I was actually falling in love, like growing to love nature and all of the animals and the trees and the vegetation and everything about the natural world, the mountains, the rocks, the waters. Just because I grew up immersed in it, it seems so natural to love it and enjoy it. And like Hannah, my family, we did like a hobby farm and, raised the small livestock and did all the canning too. So you just kind of grow up loving it. You don't remember a time when you didn't love it.
It's a good thing you found each other.
Yeah, it is. She actually tells the story in the book.
I remember. It was a very moving story. Yeah. Hannah, sometimes books that feature meditations on nature can seem a little detached from day-to-day realities. And when that kind of writing focuses just on flowers and sunsets and all things that are obviously beautiful, to me, it's almost as if they aren't talking about the real world of nature as we all actually know it. In Turning of Days, you call attention to the sublime things, but you don't turn away from grittier realities as well. And you find potential meaning in both, actually. I'm wondering if you could comment on that, but maybe as a way into that, read a passage and talk about your choice in this case to focus on weeds and shame, as you do on page 59 and following.
Yeah, this passage is from an essay on trying to keep our garden weed free and coming about into middle of the season and realizing that that is just a failing venture, that you're up against forces that even in your best efforts, you cannot overcome. So this is just a description of that moment in the season and what our garden looks like. The tomatoes have grown strong, but hornworms as long and as thick as my thumb drag their fat green bodies along the stems. Cucumber plants have climbed a leaning trellis, but cucumber bugs threaten the very vines that hold them there. White moss dance above the broccoli and cabbage, occasionally dropping down to lay their eggs on them. Eggs that, left unchecked, will hatch into larvae to be discovered in my kitchen. Down at the bottom of the garden, the potatoes are covered in striped brown beetles, happily feasting on their leaves. And while we haven't had a good rain in weeks, somehow the weeds continue to grow. Chickweed, henbit, dandelion, plantain, and lamb's quarter. Perhaps we should have planted them in the first place. I grab a handful of foxtail, wrapping my fists around as much of it as I can. I don't wear gloves because I never have. This is how I've always fought the weeds and the world, bare-knuckled and determined. Hunched over, I lower my center of gravity and use my body as a counterweight. It's a tug of war, and if my hands slip, they'll burn with a dozen tiny cuts as the blades of grass slice through my skin. We call them blades for a reason. I hold tight, willing the clump to loosen, and suddenly with a pop, it does. As the roots come up, I go down, and a fine mist of powdery earth sprays into the air, enveloping me in the dust. It's here in this part of the season that I most feel the words of Genesis. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil, you will eat food from it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow, you will eat your food and will return to the ground, since from it you were taken. And for dust you are, and to dust you will return. So I think one of the things that I definitely wanted to disabuse people of is this sentimentality toward the natural world. Now, there is plenty of awe and wonder and plenty to be inspired by. But growing up the way I did and working in the garden, you can't do that kind of work very long without recognizing that the earth is set against you in some ways. It's not necessarily your adversary, but you have different priorities. And I think that tension of whose priorities will be allowed to flourish is a true one. And I think it's one that we dismiss to our own detriment. And I think it's maybe the same way that if you're developing a relationship with a friend or a lover, you don't stop at this romanticism. You don't just know them in these caricature ways. You really want to know the depth of who they are and the complexity of all that is involved in that relationship. And I think, too, that there is just a level of suffering and brokenness to our experience of the world that it seems to me that if we come to creation and try to deny that we're not actually learning from it. We're not actually learning what it's trying to teach us. It is not given, it is not just to understand this transcendent experience to lift us up above the brokenness. There is a very true, there's something very profoundly rich and true at seeing the tensions within the natural world and understanding and embracing them as what is real. So I wanted, insofar as possible, to help readers begin to crack open that category. That I think a lot of times, especially for those who are within, the modern church, and we talk about nature in very glowing terms and this kind of sentimental embrace of it, and they want to just say yes, but it's not the whole truth. I mean, let's be people who let nature speak for itself, and let's listen to what's actually happening here. And we've talked about this a lot, Nathan and I, because in particular, his gardening efforts, you put trees in and they die. And what are you supposed to do with that? Or you put trees in and you care for them and they don't produce what your work should have produced if all things were what they should have been. And I think those are realities that transcend cultivation. They transcend just working in the garden or whatever, but they are things that we have to grapple with. And I think we have to be honest about them.
Nathan, I'm wondering if you wanted to comment on that from an artist's perspective. And I'll just throw out something that comes to mind as I hear Hannah talking. I think about my daughter, who is 18, an artist and studying to become an artist. And her emerging kind of operant philosophy in her art is that she looks for meaning in brokenness. And so she finds that sometimes, while artists might be tempted to focus only on what's beautiful, she also understands that there's meaning elsewhere, and we'll miss the message, as you put it, Hannah, if we let ourselves be blinded to a more holistic perspective. But I'm wondering, how does that resonate with you? And in terms of what you were drawing in the book, how does that reflect what Hannah is saying?
Yeah, one of the things that came to my mind when Hannah was speaking a moment ago was there is a great sense of beauty in nature, but you can't have beauty without some kind of startledness or some kind of darkness. Even like your daughter mentioned, the brokenness leads you to the hope on the other side. And there's so much in nature that is breathtakingly beautiful. But at the same time, that's only part of the truth. And you wouldn't necessarily appreciate the beauty if you didn't experience the brokenness or see the ugliness or see the curse or know the weeds or experience the blackness of suffering. And so I think art is a way for people to grapple with that. There are certain pieces of art that you just look at and you're just in awe of, both by the technique and the subject matter. And then there are pieces of art that you're standing in front of in a museum and they are kind of grotesque, but you don't want to turn away from it just yet because you want to let it speak to you. Because I think we know as human beings that there's a lot of pain and suffering and blackness and evil in the world. And when we gloss over it and don't let it kind of get into our souls, it minimizes the beauty. It minimizes the awe and wonder of the world as well, because there isn't the contrast. One of the basic principles of art is contrast in your composition. And so you want the colors to contrast each other and to work well, complementary colors, orange and blue, they're contrast on the opposite side of the color wheel, but they work together to show and magnify each other. I think as an artist, you have to have both. And so in the book, there are things that are somewhat, I guess you might use the word grotesque. I mean, there's a skull in there. There's antlers on a deer skull. And so you do have these illusions. It's not like what you think of a nature calendar where you have these beautiful mountains and oceans and the flowers. But there are some things that reference death and remind us that we will return to the dust. But then there's also the hope of the resurrection, of coming new life in the spring, of the new flowers coming, of the new shoots. You mentioned Isaiah earlier about the branch coming up. That's the hope. And so I think you have to have both in art. And I tried to represent it there.
One of my favorite compositions is a bird skull that you did. He had found this bird skull and it was so delicate and so fragile. And you had spent some time sketching it. And I had spent time kind of contemplating that question of the fragility of life. And the scripture talks about the sparrows that fall and that God is aware of this fragility. And so the things that I found somewhat striking in the layout, we open this particular essay with, I believe, an image of a bird. And it's very prosaic and it's a junco. It's very, there's a bird. We love birds. And you turn the page and there's a bird skull. And we wanted readers to have to wrestle with that is the reality. And that's the fragility that we're up against in this larger life and in the world. So I really loved that sketch. I don't think we're like very brave. We're not pushing boundaries in a way that would be recognizable, but we're hoping to tweak maybe a little bit.
As you interact with nature, you don't see death every single time you're there. There is some proportions to it. And even I think proportions, another, an artistic tool and guidelines, you have to have the right proportions. If it was just a whole book full of death and despair, and there are books like that, and you could probably draw enough pictures like that or illustrate or have some that kind of art. You don't want to leave people in the despair. You don't want to leave them in the darkness. And so it has to be proportioned to what is representative in nature. You don't find skulls every day. You see a lot more live deer than you do dead ones. You talk about seeing a dead deer in the book. And so I think it just has to be proportionate to what people can handle and to what nature itself is saying, because I think life is so much more powerful than death. And so life is the dominating force, but death is there too. So that has to be illustrated in a proportionate way.
So I'll put the question to each of you. These days, what are the things that are causing you to despair? And then correspondingly, where are you finding your hope?
Well, I think 2020 has been a year of despair. But I guess maybe a little bit more specifically for me, I have a seminary degree. I've been a pastor in a church for about 15 years, not currently pastoring at the moment. But I think the despair for me is that Christians have lost their voice and they have lost their focus on what is true and good and beautiful. And they have replaced it with things that are empty and vain, I guess. They have lost the beauty of who Christ is and what he created and what he is doing. And they have replaced it with things they're not good and beautiful, I guess. And I think having devoted our whole lives to the church, it's a sad and despairing thing. But at the same time, I find a great deal of hope just being out in nature. It is a reminder of the power of life over death. It is a reminder that life marches on. It is a reminder that even in the brokenness, there is beauty. Even yesterday, after we went to church, I went on a walk about 2 hours around this nature preserve with my binoculars and my camera. And it is a place where I find hope and peace out in the created world. And I guess to bring this full circle, one of the things with the book is we want people to say, yes, I believe these tenets, these truths of the Christian faith, but there's a lot to learn from nature as well. And we can find the same message in both places if we just listen.
I think the places where I'm most tempted to despair is when I realize that we're having the same conversations over and over and over and over again. And I think when I was younger, there was a sense of my own experience and awareness. And I thought, we as a group, as a church, as a society, we're going to tackle this particular conversation and we're going to fix it and get over it and move forward. And then, time passes and you realize, both with historical context and all of the other things, you think, oh, we're just having the same conversations and the same struggles and the same tensions within ourselves that we've always had. And that, I think for a while, that was a point of despair for me, because it felt like, oh, we're just on this hamster wheel and we're just going to rotate through a set of conversations and we're never going to reach resolution. And then I think what turned to a bit of hope for me was the understanding that in each moment, in each generation, the call is not necessarily to fix or resolve the conversation for all time. It's to be a faithful witness to truth and beauty within that moment. And that the hope is that we are participating in something larger than ourselves, and that our call is not necessarily to fix all that's wrong with the world so much as to participate in this larger redemption, and that redemption is sure and will happen despite the cycling of conversations that feel like they're never being resolved. I think for me personally, it's shifting my attention away from trying to fix everything that I see that's broken to being useful in the process of redemption and aligning myself with the forces of redemption in this moment that I have been called to.
We've been in conversation with author Hannah Anderson and her husband, Nathan Anderson. Their book, Turning of Days, Lessons from Nature, Season, and Spirit, which I highly recommend, will be released by Moody Press this week. If you want to know more about this book and its authors, check out the show notes for this episode. Earthkeepers Podcast explores ways in which we can change ourselves, our communities, and our cultures to help us to care for the earth in holistic and regenerative ways. Through curated conversations, we highlight the wisdom of thought leaders and change agents who are making a difference and showing us a way forward. When Earthkeepers stand together, they amplify the impact of their resistance against environmental injustice and multiply their efforts for renewal and restoration. We invite you to become a financial supporter of Earthkeepers. Please visit our website at www.circlewood.online/Earthkeepers to make a donation that will help expand the reach and frequency of this production. It also helps us immensely when you leave a positive review on Apple Podcasts. And please share this podcast with anyone you know who seeks to become an agent of change and advocacy for the good of the earth. This podcast is an expression of Circlewood, an organization whose purpose it is to cultivate transformative communities that love and care for all creation. I'm Forrest Dinsley, your podcast host. Our executive producer is James Amadon. Forrest Reed is our sound engineer and the creator of our original music. Our research assistant is Rochelle Nordman. Thank you, friends, for listening. and please join us for our next conversation on the Earth Keepers podcast.